To speak of the Industrial Revolution is to describe the moment when the economy stopped growing in cycles measured by generations and began accelerating within a single lifetime, when production escaped the limits of muscle wind and water and became driven by machines that did not tire, complain, or remember the world before them. This was not merely a technological shift, but a psychological rupture, because for the first time in history, societies experienced sustained economic growth, not as a blessing of nature or conquest, but as a process that could be engineered, expanded, and repeated. The Industrial Revolution did not simply change how goods were made. It rewired how people understood work, wealth, time, and progress itself. Before industrialization, economic life was overwhelmingly constrained by biology and geography. Output rose slowly. Population gains were swallowed by subsistence limits, and prosperity was fragile, easily erased by war, disease, or weather. Wealth existed, but it was concentrated, static, and often disconnected from productivity. The Industrial Revolution shattered this equilibrium by introducing a new relationship between capital, labor, and energy. Steam engines turned coal into motion factories, concentrated workers and machines under one roof, and productivity began to compound. For the first time, output could grow faster than population, breaking humanity out of the Malthusian trap that had governed economic history for thousands of years. This transformation began quietly in Britain, not because of a single invention, but because of a rare alignment of conditions. Secure property rights, deep capital markets, access to coal colonial trade networks, and a culture that tolerated experimentation created an environment where innovation could survive failure. Textile machines, ironworks, and steam power spread not because they were immediately efficient everywhere, but because they unlocked scale. Once production moved from households to factories, time itself was reorganized. Work became synchronized to machines. Wages replaced subsistence, and labor became something that could be bought, disciplined, and optimized. Economic activity was no longer seasonal or local. It became continuous and urban. The financial dimension of this shift is often underestimated, yet it was decisive. Industrialization required enormous upfront investment: canals, railways, machinery, and urban infrastructure, none of which could be financed through traditional savings alone. Banks, joint stock companies, and capital markets expanded to meet this demand, transforming finance from a facilitator of trade into a driver of structural change. Credit no longer merely smoothed transactions, it built the future. This altered the risk profile of entire societies because prosperity now depended on long-term expectations about growth, stability, and demand. When those expectations were met, wealth expanded dramatically. When they failed, crises became deeper and more systemic. The social consequences were equally profound. Industrialization created unprecedented wealth, but it distributed it unevenly. Factory owners, financiers, and skilled engineers surged ahead, while unskilled workers endured harsh conditions, long hours, and urban squalor. Inequality widened, not because growth failed, but because institutions lagged behind technology. Child labor, dangerous workplaces, and environmental degradation were not accidents. They were the price of growth in a world where regulation and social insurance hadn't yet caught up. Over time, labor movements, political reform, and state intervention emerged as responses to these tensions, reshaping capitalism itself and redefining the social contract between growth and protection. On a global scale, the Industrial Revolution reordered power. Nations that industrialized early gained overwhelming advantages in production, military capability, and trade, while those that did not were pushed into subordinate roles as raw material suppliers or captive markets. Economic divergence widened dramatically, creating a gap between industrial and non-industrial regions that still shapes global inequality today. Industrialization was therefore not a neutral process. It was a force multiplier, amplifying existing advantages and locking in new hierarchies that proved difficult to escape. Perhaps the most consequential change, however, was psychological. Industrial societies began to expect progress as normal rather than exceptional. Growth became a baseline assumption, and stagnation came to be seen as failure rather than fate. This shift in expectation transformed politics, finance, and culture. Governments were judged on economic performance, investors on returns, and individuals on productivity. The future became something to be planned, invested in, and optimized rather than feared or accepted. In this sense, the Industrial Revolution did not merely create modern economies, it created modern anxiety, because once growth becomes expected, its absence feels catastrophic. Yet embedded within this transformation was a contradiction that would only become clearer with time. The same systems that enabled unprecedented growth also increased fragility. Concentrated production, leveraged finance, and global interdependence meant that shocks could propagate faster and further than ever before. Booms became bigger busts, more painful, and crises less containable. The Industrial Revolution gave humanity the tools to generate wealth at scale, but it also bound that wealth to complex systems whose failure could not be localized or easily repaired. And it is at this precise juncture where industrial capitalism reveals both its extraordinary creative power and its growing systemic risk that the next movement of this story must begin. Because to understand the full economic transformation unleashed by industrialization, we must now examine how cycles of boom and bust, technological displacement, and financial instability became recurring features of a world that had finally learned how to grow faster than it knew how to stabilize begin. Because once industrial capitalism revealed its capacity to generate sustained growth, it also revealed a darker rhythm beneath that growth, a cycle of expansion and contraction that would come to define the modern economic experience. The Industrial Revolution did not eliminate instability. It reorganized it. Where pre-industrial crises were driven by harvest failure or war, industrial crises were driven by overinvestment, credit expansion, and sudden reversals of expectation. The economy had learned how to grow faster than before, but it had not yet learned how to absorb disappointment at the same speed. Boom and bust became structural features rather than anomalies. Factories were built ahead of demand, railways laid before traffic justified them, and capital flowed toward the promise of future productivity with increasing confidence. When expectations were fulfilled, prosperity surged. When they were not, contraction followed brutally. Financial panics in the 19th century were not signs that industrialization was failing, but evidence that it was working through a new and volatile logic, one in which optimism could scale nationally and collapse just as quickly. Credit amplified this process, turning misjudgments into cascades because borrowed money does not wait patiently for correction. At the same time, technological displacement reshaped labor in ways that challenged social stability. Machines increased output, but reduced the need for certain skills, forcing workers to adapt or fall behind. This was not a temporary shock, but a recurring condition as each wave of innovation rendered some forms of labor obsolete, while creating new ones that required retraining, mobility, and resilience. Industrial societies were therefore compelled to invent social mechanisms to manage disruption, public education, labor law, welfare systems, and eventually macroeconomic policy. Not out of benevolence, but out of necessity. Growth without cohesion proved politically unsustainable. The role of the state expanded accordingly. Governments that once limited themselves to taxation and defense became managers of economic stability, tasked with smoothing cycles, protecting employment, and responding to crises that markets alone could not resolve. This was a radical transformation of political responsibility. Economic downturns were no longer acts of God. They were failures of policy, and legitimacy increasingly depended on performance. The Industrial Revolution thus redefined sovereignty itself, tying political survival to economic outcomes and embedding finance deeply into the structure of governance. By the early 20th century, the full implications of industrial capitalism became unmistakable. Globalized production, integrated financial markets, and mass employment meant that shocks no longer remained local. The Great Depression exposed the systemic risk inherent in an industrialized world, where collapse in one sector or country could propagate across continents. Recovery required not only time, but coordination, monetary reform, fiscal intervention, and institutional redesign. The lesson was stark. An economy capable of extraordinary growth also required extraordinary management, and neglecting that responsibility carried costs measured not just in lost output, but in social trauma. Yet despite its crises, industrial capitalism endured because it delivered something unprecedented: the ability to raise living standards persistently over time. The challenge was never whether industrialization worked, but how to govern its consequences. Over generations, societies learned imperfectly through trial, error, and reform how to balance innovation with protection, efficiency with equity, and growth with stability. These compromises were never final, but they allowed industrial economies to evolve rather than implode. Seen across the full arc of history, the Industrial Revolution appears less as a single event than as a permanent condition, the moment when humanity entered an era of self-accelerating change. Every technological wave since electricity, automobiles, computers, digital networks has followed the same underlying pattern, established in the 18th and 19th centuries. Productivity surges, finance expands, inequality strains, cohesion, crises force adjustment, and institutions adapt just enough to allow the cycle to continue. Industrialization did not end. It became the baseline. The enduring lesson of this transformation is neither celebration nor condemnation, but realism. Growth is not free, stability is not automatic, and progress is not evenly distributed. The Industrial Revolution taught humanity how to generate wealth at scale, but it also taught that such power must be continuously governed, because systems that amplify creation also amplify error. Understanding this legacy is essential because the modern world still lives inside the economic architecture industrialization built, still wrestling with its promises and its contradictions. If this exploration of the Industrial Revolution and economic transformation has deepened how you understand growth inequality and financial cycles, then you are engaging with history in the way it demands to be used as a guide rather than a monument. If you want to continue following how these forces evolve through later crises, reforms, and technological shifts, subscribe to the channel and stay with these stories, and leave a comment sharing which part of industrial capitalism you think we still struggle to manage today. Because the revolution that began with steam and steel never truly ended. It simply changed its tools, and its lessons remain as urgent now as they were when the first factories began to hum.